The sky was red, and broken fire rained down from the clouds, and the sound of screaming filled the air as Commander Lyra stood on the last wall of her city. Her armor was cracked, her hands were shaking, but her eyes were cold and full of pain. She had fought for so long. She had watched her people die one by one, and now there was nothing left but the end. The enemy was close. They moved like shadows with metal skin and red lights in their heads. They did not speak. They did not stop. They only destroyed everything in their path. And now they were coming for the last bunker, the final place, where few of her kind still lived, or hid, or waited to die. Lyra turned and walked down the stairs. Inside the bunker, the walls shook with each explosion. The lights flickered, and children cried in the dark. Some soldiers still stood holding weapons, with no power, their eyes hollow, their hearts empty. They looked at her with silent questions, but she had no answers left to give. She reached the control room. The screen showed red marks moving fast toward them. Her second-in-command stood beside her, blood on his face, fear in his voice. He asked if they should surrender. She looked at him and said, "No, we die as warriors, not as slaves." Then she opened a small panel and placed her hand on a glowing switch. It was the self-destruct. If the enemy entered this place, she would take everything with her. A message was sent into space. Just a few words to anyone who might hear, to any stars that might still care. Her voice was calm, but her heart was broken. She said, "We are the last. We did not bend. We did not run. Let the universe remember that we chose to die free." The sound of battle grew louder. They were at the door, now metal claws tearing through steel, voices rising in fear, weapons firing uselessly. The children were crying louder. The soldiers braced for death, and Lyra stood tall, ready to push the switch and end it all. Then something strange happened. A loud crash shook the ground, but it did not come from the enemy. It came from above. A great shadow passed over the ceiling, then metal twisted and broke, and fire exploded downward. A ship crashed through the upper level, landing hard in the middle of the base. Smoke filled the air. Alarms screamed. The enemy paused, confused by the sudden chaos. From the wreck, a figure stepped out, tall, strong, wrapped in black armor, with a glowing blue mark on his chest. He moved like a storm, fast and deadly. His weapon fired blue energy that cut down the enemy. Before they could react, he shouted something, but the language was strange, not hers, not known. Lyra raised her weapon, aimed it at him, her finger ready to pull the trigger. He turned and looked at her. His face was half covered by a mask, but his eyes were human and full of fire. He shouted again, this time in her language, barely correct, but clear enough. He said, "Get down if you want to live." Lyra did not move. She did not lower her weapon. She stared at this strange human, this sudden ghost from the stars. She did not know if he was friend or trick, if he had come to save her or take what was left. He raised his hands, not in attack, but in peace, his voice softer. "Now," he said, "I am not your enemy. I heard your call. I came to help." More enemies entered the room. The human turned and fought again, his weapon glowing bright, his moves quick and sharp. One came close, but he blocked with his arm and shot it through the head, then turned back to her, waiting for a choice. Lyra looked around, her people still alive, but afraid. The enemy still coming, the switch still waiting behind her, ready to end it all. She had been ready to die moments ago, her mind made up, her soul already burning with loss. But now this man stood between death and something else, something unknown, something strange. She lowered her weapon, just a little, not trust, not hope, just a question. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her with eyes full of something strong, something stubborn, and said, "I am Captain Rourke, and I do not let good people die." Then the wall behind them exploded again, and everything turned to fire and screams. Smoke filled the air as fire danced across the bunker floor. The roof had nearly collapsed, and bodies lay still in the rubble. But Commander Lyra stood alive, her breath heavy, her weapon still hot in her hands, her eyes locked on the strange human who now stood beside her, bleeding from a cut on his brow, his armor scorched, but his stance firm, like a wall that refused to fall. She still did not trust him. His words were strange, his timing too perfect, but something deep in her chest, something ancient and silent, whispered that he had not come to kill her. He had come for something else, something bigger than both of them. More enemy drones dropped to the ceiling, their red lights scanning, their metal arms raised to fire. But the human moved with impossible speed. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her behind a shattered wall, his voice urgent, his breath fast. He said, "This place will not hold. We must move now." Lyra hesitated. Her instincts screamed to stay, and fight to die with her people, but most were already gone or lost or too broken to move. She had sworn to protect them all, but now the only way to do that was to live and find out why the stars had sent this man to her at the very end. So she nodded once and followed him through a broken corridor, past flames and blood, and twisted steel, her boots echoing behind his as they ran deeper into the earth, away from the fire above. They reached a sealed door half buried in rubble. The human knelt and pulled a strange tool from his belt. It hummed softly as he worked. Lyra watched him, her mind full of questions, but none of them had answers, yet only silence and the sound of the tool cutting through ancient metal. The door opened with a hiss, and they slipped into the dark beyond. The air was cold and dry, the light faint and green from cracked wall strips. She had never seen this tunnel before, though it was part of her own world, maybe older than her maps, maybe hidden for a reason. As they walked, Lyra kept her weapon raised, her eyes scanning every corner. The human walked ahead, but not too far, always checking back, always careful. His silence felt like respect, not control, and though she hated the feeling, she began to feel something like safety beside him. She finally asked, "Why are you here? Why would a human come for us, after all we have done, after all we believed?" He stopped, turned slowly, and said, "We heard your message. We know the stories told about us, but not all stories are true, and not all humans want war. Some of us just want to stop the end before it comes for everyone." Lyra did not reply because she had no words. Her people had grown on fear of Earth, taught to see humans as monsters. Yet here was one bleeding and risking his life for strangers, and not asking for anything in return. They moved again, down twisting tunnels, past strange carvings and old machines covered in dust and webs. One door stood taller than the rest, its surface carved with markings that pulsed with soft blue light. Lyra stepped forward, drawn by something inside her, like a memory not her own. She reached out her hand, and the door opened without a sound. The human looked surprised, but said nothing. Inside was a chamber, round and deep, filled with strange machines, and a single glowing pillar in the center. It hummed with life even after all these years. Lyra stepped toward it slowly, her fingers shaking, her heart pounding. The pillar reacted to her presence, lights dancing along its side, forming shapes and images. Voices spoke in a forgotten tongue, yet somehow she understood them. They showed her visions of the past, a time before her kind, before the humans, before even the stars were young. A war had raged across galaxies. A great force had risen that fed on death and chaos. It had no face, no name, just hunger. It destroyed everything in its path until all life united against it and sealed it away in darkness. But war returned over the ages, and with each new fight the prison weakened. Each act of hate was like a crack in a wall, and now the cracks were wide and deep, and the hunger had returned, and it was feeding once more. Lyra fell to her knees, her head spinning, her chest tight. She saw the truth, her people's endless wars, the hate, the pride. It had all helped wake the beast again, and now it would come, not just for her world, but for every world. The human knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, steady and strong. He said, "I saw the same thing on another planet before it was taken. I failed to stop it then, but maybe together we still have a chance." She looked into his eyes and saw no lie, no trick, just pain and fire and hope, the kind of hope that only burns in those who have lost everything and still stand to fight again. Suddenly a sound echoed through the chamber. The walls shook, dust fell from above. The enemy had followed them. Even here, deep underground, metal feet pounded the floor as red eyes lit the darkness and gunfire broke the silence. Lyra and the human moved together like one. His weapon fired blue streaks through the air as fired silver bolts. Their enemies fell, but more came, always more, always hungry. The human was hit once, then twice, but he did not fall. He shouted, "Keep moving," and led her down a side passage just before a blast tore through the chamber behind them. They ran through narrow halls, barely lit, barely stable, until they reached a ledge that opened into a vast empty space below. Strange towers reached from the ground to the ceiling, and strange machines blinked in the dark. It felt ancient and powerful and not dead. "This is the core of the human," said. "It powers the entire system. We can use it to send a warning to Earth, to others who still fight." But before he could move again, a shadow dropped from above, something huge and alive, not metal but bone and skin, and eyes glowing like fire. It landed between them and screamed without sound, its mouth wide, its body shifting and wrong. Lyra felt fear like she had never known she fired, and the human fired, but the creature moved like smoke, fast and wild and endless. It knocked Rourke aside and charged, her teeth bared, claws reaching. She stood frozen, not ready, not fast enough. But then Rourke was there again, between her and the beast's body, taking the blow as he shouted, "Get out now, run!" But she did not run, not this time, not again. She raised her weapon and screamed and fired and kept firing until the light filled the room and the creature screamed back and vanished into the dark. She dropped beside the human, blood on his side, but he was alive. His eyes met hers, and he smiled just a little through the pain. "You stayed," he said. "Yes," she answered, and for the first time she meant it. The air was thick with heat and dust as Lyra helped Rourke to his feet, his armor dented aside, bleeding, but his spirit unbroken. They stood at the edge of the vast chamber deep below the surface, where the strange towers hummed with ancient power, and lights moved like rivers across walls that had not seen life in 1,000 years. Lyra could not look away from the symbols glowing across the towers. They were not of her people, and not of Earth either, but something older, something that breathed with meaning even without words. She reached out, and her fingers touched the closest symbol, and at once the tower responded. A wave of energy surged through the room, and a soft voice filled her mind, not in language, but in thought, like dreams made of light. The voice told a story not of heroes or kings, but of fire and silence, a war so large it swallowed suns, a hunger so deep it cracked the bones of the stars, a creature that was not born, but made from the ashes of peace. It had no name, only purpose, and that purpose was to consume and evolve and spread, and when the galaxy stood against it, they could not kill it, only trap it inside a prison of light and stone, buried deep across many worlds, sealed with thought and fear and ancient blood. But the prison was never meant to last forever. Each war, each weapon, each cry of hate across the stars was like a key turning a lock, and now the final locks were breaking, and the hunger was rising again. Lyra pulled her hand back and staggered, the light fading from her eyes, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She turned to Rourke and said, "This is not just a war, it is a warning. Everything we know, everything we fight for is part of a cycle that feeds it. We are the reason it wakes." Rourke nodded slowly, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes clear. He said, "I saw the same on the ruins of Vera 9, the same symbols, the same warnings. I tried to tell Earth, but they did not listen. They said I was broken. Now, maybe they will believe you." They moved deeper into the core, the walls narrowing, the towers rising higher. Machines, once silent, now began to stir, their lights blinking, their voices whispering, the old systems waking as if sensing their presence. Lyra and Rourke stepped onto a platform that lifted them without sound toward the highest chamber at the top of the core, where the heart of the ancient system waited. As the doors opened, they saw a sphere floating in the center of the room, covered in flowing symbols and surrounded by rings of light, moving in slow, endless patterns. It pulsed with life and power and memory, the very mind of the place, and it spoke not with sound, but through the air around them, through the walls, through their bones. The voice said, "You have touched the past, you have seen the truth. Now you must choose the future. This place holds the last of the ancient fire, the last light that can seal the hunger again, but it cannot do so alone. It needs will and sacrifice and unity, something the stars have forgotten." Lyra stepped forward, her voice shaking. She asked, "What do you mean by sacrifice?" The light answered, not with words, but with visions, a moment where the sphere explodes, sending waves of energy through space, sealing the hunger back into its prison, but also ending itself, and all within reach, including those who ignite it, including the spark. Rourke looked at Lyra, and she looked at him, both silent, both knowing what the cost would be, and yet neither stepped back, neither turned away, because they had seen too much, lost too many, and now stood at the last gate, between survival and extinction. Before they could speak again, the walls shook with a roar, and the chamber lights dimmed. The enemy had found them again. The floor split, and creatures poured in, not metal, not flesh, but something between their shapes, twisted, their eyes empty. They moved not like soldiers, but like extensions of one great mind the hunger made real. Lyra and Rourke fought side by side, her blades flashing, his rifle burning, their bodies pushed to the edge, but they held the line, each breath a promise, each strike a scream of defiance. The sphere spoke again. It said, "The fire is ready, but it needs a bearer, one who will carry it to the center of the enemy ship and light it from within. No return, no escape, only the end of one to save the many." Rourke turned to her, his face set, his voice calm. He said, I will go, I know their ships. I can reach the core and light the fire. But Lyra stepped between him and the sphere, her eyes hard, her voice cold. She said, no, this is my world, this is my fault. I should be the one to carry it. They argued not in anger, but in sorrow, each trying to carry the burden for the other, until the sphere pulsed again and said, it must be one who carries the relic, one who the old systems will obey. And the relic had already chosen Lyra when she touched the first door, when the symbols answered her call. Rourke bowed his head, then stepped forward and placed something in her hand, a small chip, glowing faintly. This will guide your path. He said, it will link you to my ship and open the route to the enemy core. I will hold them off as long as I can. Lyra nodded, her heart breaking, but her hands steady. She took the sphere into her chest, where it melted into her armor, into her skin, its light becoming hers, her eyes now glowing with ancient fire. They ran through the corridors as the core collapsed. Behind the machines, screaming sparks, flying enemies. Chasing Rourke turned at the fork and shouted, this way leads to the sky, go now. She looked back, once saw him take a stand alone against the swarm, his weapon blazing, his roar louder than the enemy scream, and then she turned and ran into the light. The tunnel rose fast, air whistling past her, the chip guiding her steps, lights blinking with her every move. Above the surface the night had fallen and enemy ships filled the sky, but through the smoke and flame she saw a small human dropship rise from the dust. Doors open, systems ready. It had waited just as Rourke said it would. She jumped aboard, the ship closed and took off, rising fast toward the stars, toward the enemy flagship that hovered like a god over the planet below, its shape massive, its skin moving, its heart calling to the hunger. The ship flew through the battle, dodging blasts, slipping between enemy lines until it reached the belly of the beast and dove, and without fear or pause. Inside was darkness and sound and pain. Voices not hers filled her mind, memories not hers filled her soul. The hunger knew she was there, and it laughed not with joy but with confidence, because it had faced hope before and always devoured it. But this time was different. This time hope had fire and a name and a reason to burn. She reached the core of the ship, a chamber of hearts and screams, where the prisoners of war and time were held, their minds wired into the engine, their thoughts powering the hunger. She stepped into the center of the sphere. Inside her, now pulsing like a second heartbeat, her hands raised, her voice rising. She called out to every lost soul, every dying dream, every forgotten light. She said, I do this not for glory, not for revenge, but for tomorrow. And then she let go. The moment Lyra released the fire, the chamber inside the enemy flagship turned white with light. The air became weightless. The screams of the trapped minds shifted into something calmer, softer, like a wave washing over a dead shore. The hunger roared inside her mind, trying to hold on, clawing at her thoughts, showing her images of fear and loss. But she pushed forward with every step, letting the ancient fire flow from her into the walls and floors and heart of the living machine. The enemy ship shuddered as if in pain, its skin rippling, its shape twisting. The glow from her armor spread out into lines across the chamber, racing through corridors and engines burning through the dark power that fed the beast. Each line carried the same message, not in words, but in feeling. You will not have us, you will not win. As the light grew, the ship began to pull inward like it was being folded into itself, every surface warping, every scream fading. The hunger still pushed against her mind, whispering promises of power if she would stop. But she refused. She thought of her people, of the faces she had lost, of the soldiers who had stood their ground, of the children who had cried in the bunker. She thought of Rourke bleeding and fighting so she could reach this place, and she let the fire consume her fear until there was nothing left. The final surge hit, and the flagship cracked apart in silence, the pieces turning to dust before they could fall into the gravity of the planet below. The stars came back into view. The battle outside froze for a moment as both human and alien ships saw the great shadow vanish from the sky. Lyra floated in the center of the collapsing core, her armor barely holding her body, trembling, the light within her dimming. As the fire finished its work, she felt the sphere fade from her chest, and for a moment she thought it was over. But then the floor beneath her split, and she fell into darkness. She landed hard on a surface that was neither metal nor stone. It was warm and faintly glowing. She looked around and saw a vast empty space, lit only by slow pulses of light, like the heartbeat of something ancient in the distance. A shape moved. It was not the hunger, not the twisted metal or bone of the creatures she had fought, but something like a figure, tall and cloaked in shadow. The figure spoke in the same silent way the sphere had, but its voice was deeper, heavier. It said, "You have done what many could not. You have cut the chains for now, but chains can be forged again, and locks can be broken again. Do you understand?" Lyra said yes, her voice small but steady. The figure stepped closer, and the light revealed a face not human, not of her kind, but a blend of both. And neither the eyes were stars. The skin was carved with symbols that shifted as it moved. It said, "The hunger will sleep, but not forever. There will come a day when it stirs again, and it will look for you. For the one who held the fire, you must be ready." She asked, "What are you?" It answered, "I am the memory of those who fought before the last echo of the first war. I cannot fight again, but I can give you what you will need when the time comes." Then it placed a hand over her heart, and she felt a spark enter her, a seed of the ancient fire, not enough to destroy, but enough to awaken when called. Before she could speak again, the space around her began to fade. The warmth turned cold, and the figure stepped back into shadow, saying, "Remember who you are. Remember why you fight." Her eyes opened to the cold black of space, her body floating among the dust of the flagship. She gasped for breath and saw lights ahead, a small human dropship racing toward her. The rear hatch opened, and strong hands pulled her inside. She looked up and saw Rourke, alive though battered, his armor torn, his face pale, but his smile bright. He said, "I thought I lost you." She whispered, "Almost did." The dropship rose out of the battle zone, human and alien ships now holding formation together, firing in unison against the smaller enemy craft that remained. The great threat was gone, but the war was not over yet. They still had to push the enemy back and seal the cracks the hunger had used to reach them. They returned to the human command ship, where leaders of both species waited. The tension in the room was sharp, the old hatred still there, but shaken by the sight of what had just happened. When Lyra told them of the hunger of the prison and of the danger still to come, some doubted, but Rourke spoke for her, his voice strong, saying, "I have seen it too, I have fought it, and I know this war is bigger than any of us. If we do not stand together, none of us will stand at all." Slowly the room shifted. The alien warlord, who had once sworn to burn Earth, now offered his hand. The human admiral, who had cursed the alien name, now accepted it. They spoke not of surrender, but of alliance, a new line drawn not between species, but between the living and the hunger that waited beyond. After the meeting, Lyra stood on the deck, looking out at the stars, her armor still carrying the faint glow of the fire. Rourke joined her, leaning on the rail, his body tired, but his eyes still watching the sky. He asked what happened in there after the ship broke apart. She told him not everything, just enough to make him understand there is more coming, maybe not soon, but one day, and when it does, we have to be ready. He nodded slowly, then said, "Then we start preparing now." For the first time since the fall of her city, Lyra felt something that was not rage or grief. It was a quiet strength of belief that maybe the end was not yet written, that maybe the cycle could be broken not by one hero or one sacrifice, but by many standing as one. Below them the fleets moved together, human and alien ships, side by side, sweeping the last of the enemy from orbit. The war for her world was ending, but a greater war waited in the dark, and when it came, she would be there with the spark in her heart and the memory of a man who had refused to let her die. She turned to Rourke and said, "Thank you for coming for me." He smiled and said, "Thank you for not dying." The stars burned bright ahead, and for the first time in a long time, Lyra let herself look toward them without fear. The stars looked calm from the command deck, but Lyra knew better. Silence in space never meant peace. It only meant waiting, the kind of quiet before a storm that knows your name. She stood beside Rourke, watching the human and alien ships floating side by side, their guns quiet, their engines humming like distant drums. Both sides still unsure, still cautious, but bound now by fire and memory. The hunger was gone for now. The great flagship turned to dust, but smaller pieces remained scattered across systems, like splinters in the flesh of the galaxy, broken, yet still sharp, still dangerous. The spark inside her had not dimmed since the fire had hummed gently in her chest, like a sleeping beast waiting for the call. Command requested her presence in the war room again and again, but she delayed each time, her thoughts restless, her heart heavier Then she let them see. Rourke noticed, of course. He always did. He said nothing, just waited beside her, quiet as the stars. At last she turned and said, "I need to see it with my own eyes, not through reports or signals. I need to know what we are truly facing." Rourke nodded. He had already prepared a ship without telling her, a sleek scout vessel, fast and quiet, armed, but built for stealth. The journey would take days across the old warpath, through the ruins of battles fought and lost. She did not ask how he got clearance. She simply boarded and sat beside him as the ship slipped into the dark. They passed the graveyard moons first, where broken cruisers still floated like corpses, lightless and cold. Lyra remembered the names of the fallen, not all, but enough to feel them close. Some were friends, some were enemies, some were both in the same breath. The next stop was the silent planet, once called Kareth, once green and full of towers, now black, and burned its atmosphere, stripped its soil, cracked. The hunger had fed deeply here and left nothing behind, not even bones, just marks in the ground like clawed fingers reaching upward in pain. But it was the third place that held the truth they were not ready for. The ship entered orbit around a dead sun where no light had touched for centuries. Yet something moved in the shadows, something massive and slow, like a mountain floating through oil. Rourke adjusted the sensors, and Lyra leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. The enemy's face was not a face at all. It was a structure, or maybe a vessel, or maybe a creature. None could say for sure. It pulsed, with faint red light lines moving across its surface, like veins. It had no windows, no engines, no markings. It simply was, and that was enough to make the stars feel smaller. It drifted through the dead system slowly, but not without purpose, its path straight, as if drawn by ancient memory, as if it followed a scent not of blood but of fear. Lyra stared at it for a long time, her heart silent, her spark whispering warnings. Too old to name this is what waited beyond this, was what the hunger left behind, what it became when it grew too large for war, when it turned itself into shape and shadow. They scanned from a distance. The results made no sense. The surface shifted with each pass, one moment smooth, the next covered in spikes, then flat again, as if it was choosing what to be, as if it knew it was being watched. Rourke whispered, "This is not a ship, this is something else." They sent no signals, made no moves, just watched and recorded until the structure slowed and turned its course, no longer random, no longer drifting. It pointed now toward a system not far from Earth, not close enough to strike today, but close enough to reach soon. Lyra stood frozen, her fingers cold, her mouth dry. "It knows," she said. "Somehow it knows what we did, what we carry, what we stopped. And it is coming to finish what it started." Rourke checked the charts, his voice low. "It will reach the outer edge in less than 2 weeks, if it keeps this speed. And if it sends anything ahead, we may not see it until it is already here." They returned to command with their evidence, but the reaction was divided. Some feared too quickly, others doubted too loudly. Some wanted to hide behind bigger guns, stronger walls. But Lyra stood before them, all her voice clear, her words sharp. "You cannot stop a storm by building higher towers. You stop it by changing the wind, by learning its shape, and making it move around you. This is not just a war, this is a test, and we will fail if we keep thinking with old minds and old fear." Rourke added, "The fire worked once, it can work again, but we need time, and unity, not walls and silence." The council broke into arguments, but some listened, and some changed, and that was enough for now, enough to begin. They started to build not weapons, but signals, beacons of peace, strange to her ears, but powerful to the old machines that slept beneath her world. And others, they awakened slowly, stretching their light into space, a call not of surrender, but of connection, a net of thought and memory, to warn before the hunger could feed again. Lyra worked through the days, barely resting, the fire in her chest growing brighter with each system, awakened each message, sent each ally, found across the stars. Even those once called enemies now answered the call, for they too had seen the face drifting through the dark. One night aboard the human flagship, she stood again on the viewing deck, stars turning slowly beyond the glass. Rourke joined her, his hand wrapped in bandages, his eyes tired but still full of fire. He asked, "Do you think it will come soon?" She nodded. "I think it is already closer than we know." He asked, "Then what do we do?" She looked at him, then beyond him into the endless black, and said, "We change everything." And they did, not because they were heroes, not because they were chosen, but because they had seen the enemy's face and understood That fear was not the end, it was the beginning of something stronger, something older than war. The fleets moved again, not to strike, but to shield the weak, to guide the lost, to light the places where the dark had taken hold. The fire was passed from ship to ship, from soul to soul, until it became something more than survival. It became unity. But even unity is not enough without sacrifice, and Lyra knew that when the hunger returned, and it would return, it would not come with noise or fury. It would come in silence, wearing the face of hope, wearing the face of memory, wearing the face of those they had once saved. And when it did, she would stand again with the fire in her chest and the spark in her soul, not to destroy, not to rule, but to remind the stars that some lights do not fade even in the shadow of the end. The stars above the battlefield turned red, as if bleeding for what was coming. The silence broke not with war cries, but with a pulse that rippled through space like the beat of a heart too old to die and too strong to forget. The enemy had arrived, not in pieces, not in scouts, not in whispers, but whole and awake, and watching. The structure they had seen drifting before now hovered at the edge of the system, its surface folding and unfolding like a wound trying to breathe. Lyra stood on the main command platform, her eyes fixed on the thing in the sky, the fire in her chest, whispering louder than ever. "It is time," she said, not to Rourke, not to the officers around her, but to herself, to the memory of those she had lost, to the voice of the stars that had gone quiet since the last strike. She turned to the Allied commanders, both human and alien, their faces marked with fear, but held up by duty. She said, "We cannot wait for it to come to us. It will not strike like an army. It will absorb like a sea if we are not inside it. First, we will never understand how to stop it again." Rourke stepped forward, his armor scarred from the last skirmish, his shoulder wrapped in makeshift fabric, but his stance tall. He said, "We go and we take the fight into the belly of the beast. We see what it really is." The room filled with protests and warnings. They spoke of risk, of madness, of being consumed by whatever mind lay behind the creature. But Lyra only raised her hand, and the room fell silent. She said, "I have touched the heart of this enemy, and I have seen its dreams. If we do not enter it willingly, it will enter us without mercy." They prepared to strike ship in silence, a hybrid design built from both human steel and alien tech, fast, sleek, and shaped like a spear meant to pierce what no one had pierced before. The crew was small, only 5 trusted souls, chosen not for strength, but for their ability to hold on to who they were when everything else tried to take it from them. Rourke was pilot, Lyra, the guide, a human engineer named Kova, a silent alien scout named Arwaix, and an old medic who had once saved Lyra's life and now came to save it again. They launched before dawn, slipping through the quiet between fleets before the enemy could shift its gaze and see them. The air inside was tight, full of tension and sweat and the kind of stillness that comes before history is written or erased. As they neared the structure, its shape became less real, more like thought wrapped in metal. Sometimes it looked like a fortress, other times like a creature, sometimes like both and neither, as if it was deciding how it wanted to be seen. Rourke said, "Sensors are useless, nothing reads right." Kova added, "Our systems think we're flying through memory, not space." Lyra closed her eyes, and the fire inside her pulsed. Once gently, she whispered, "Let me guide us." The ship turned slowly, not by controls, but by instinct, following lines that only she could see, paths carved into the dark like veins under skin, until they found an opening wide and black, a mouth that was not a mouth, but felt like one breathing in the stars. They entered, and the world changed. Inside there was no sky, no ground, just layers upon layers of twisting light, and shadow walls moved like lungs, pulsing with each step. They took. Sound did not echo, but folded in on itself. Voices whispered in languages they had never learned, yet somehow understood, not in words, but in feelings, regret, hunger, sorrow, pride, all blended into one great wave of thought. Arwaix moved ahead, his steps silent, his weapon ready, but nothing attacked, nothing moved to stop them. Instead, the ship seemed to welcome them. Doors, open paths, lit themselves, as if the enemy wanted them deeper, as if it waited for them at the center. They found rooms filled with floating shapes, fragments of memories, taken from thousands of worlds, a ruined city, from Earth a shattered temple, from Lyra's home a broken child's toy hovering beside a cracked war helmet. Each object pulsed with energy, each one a story stolen and kept like trophies. Kova scanned them and shook his head. "These are not just trophies, They are anchors. Each one holds part of a mind trapped and forced to feed this thing. The deeper they went, the stronger the pull became. Lyra felt it in her bones, in her thoughts, memories of things she had forgotten, fears she had buried, hopes she had killed, all rising again, like ghosts, wearing her own face. They reached the central core, not a room, but a space beyond shape, where all walls folded into each other, and the light burned blue and gold and black at once. In the center hung a sphere vast and alive, beating like a heart too big for the body that held it. Around it floated shapes, not fully formed, like souls, without skin, drifting in slow, painful circles. "This is the core," said Rourke. "This is where it breathes." Lyra stepped forward, her chest glowing, her fire rising, and the sphere reacted, lines of light shooting out to meet her. The pain hit her like a wave, a flood of memories. Not her soldiers, screaming stars, dying mothers, weeping children, hiding. All of it poured into her head, and she screamed, not in pain but in rage. She shouted, "You are not a god, you are a wound that refuses to close." The enemy responded not with voice but with pressure. The walls shook, the air thickened, shapes began to form around them, tall and hollow, with faces made from the crew's own fears. Arwaix saw his dead brother Kova, saw the machines that had taken his home. The medic saw her old patients crying for help. Rourke saw the face of a friend he had killed to survive. Lyra saw herself, not as she was, but as she had been before the war, before the fire, before the fall of her people, full of doubt, full of silence. The creature reached toward her with that face, as if to pull her back into it. But she stepped forward, fire flaring, her voice rising. "I am not your past, I am your end." She raised her hand, and the fire leapt from her palm, striking the core. A crack formed, the shapes screamed, the ship howled, light flooded the space, and the pain became blinding, but she held her ground. Rourke shouted, "The core is breaking, but it is drawing power from us. We must cut the link." Kova and the medic moved to the consoles, systems older than any language sparking under their touch. Arwaix fought the shadow figures, holding them off with silent fury, each movement a dance of blades and fire. Lyra reached into the core, both hands now the fire inside her burning brighter than it ever had, and for a moment she saw everything: the hunger, the first wars, the endless cycles, the truth that it was never about death, it was about forgetting who we are, about losing the light we carry within. She screamed again and poured her last strength into the sphere, breaking it apart, sending the fire through every inch of the ship, not to destroy, but to free every soul trapped, every memory bound, every light held in darkness. The ship began to collapse, folding in on itself. The crew ran back toward the exit, the path closing behind them piece by piece. Their ship still waiting, systems flaring, alarms screaming. They jumped aboard, and Rourke pushed the engines to their limit. Behind them the beast crumbled, not with a roar, but with a whisper, as if sighing in relief, as if letting go of a pain too old to hold. They flew into the stars again, the light behind them fading, the fire within. Lyra now silent, but warm, not gone, just resting. They had gone into the beast and come back, not as the same people, but as something more. The stars above them no longer looked the same. They were brighter, not in color or shape, but in meaning, as if the very sky had changed after the fall of the beast, as if the silence left behind was not emptiness, but peace waiting to begin again. The ship floated quietly, now far from the battlefield, engines resting, sensors silent, and for the first time in a long time, there was no alarm, no red flashing lights, no countdowns, only breath and heartbeat and thought. Lyra sat alone near the front window, her armor cracked her body, sore her skin marked with lines of fire that pulsed like veins of gold. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had passed, everything she had seen, everything she had become. The spark inside her had not vanished, it now felt like a part of her, like a second soul, quiet and waiting. Behind her the crew moved softly, no one spoke. Above a whisper the medic wrapped Arwaix's wounds, while Kova checked the systems. Rourke stood near the back, his hand pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the stars, as if trying to find answers in their patterns. They had survived the impossible, they had entered the heart of the enemy, and returned whole, but something still waited, not a threat, not a monster, but a question, one that burned deeper than the fire, one that could not be escaped or ignored. What now? Lyra stood and walked toward the others, her steps slow, her breath steady. When they turned to her, She looked at each one, not as a commander, not as a savior, but as a soul among souls. She said, "We stopped one piece of it, but this was only a limb. The body still stirs, and it will rise again, not today, not tomorrow, but one day, and when it does, we must be ready." Rourke nodded slowly and said, "Then we begin not a war, not a fleet, but a foundation, something stronger than weapons, something deeper than walls." The ship turned and began its journey home, though home was no longer a single world, no longer a flag or a name. It was every place where life still dared to grow, where light still dared to shine. They returned to the Alliance Council, where word of their mission had already spread. Eyes followed them as they walked through the halls of glass, and steel voices lowered heads, turned, but Lyra felt no pride, only purpose. The council chamber was filled more than ever before, not just humans and Lyra's kind, but dozens of other species that had once stayed hidden, now stood together, once enemies, now allies, joined not by treaties, but by truth. Lyra spoke first, her voice clear, her armor still scorched, her fire still warm. She told them what they had seen, what they had done, what they had learned, and what they still must do. The hunger was not just an enemy. It was a mirror, a reflection of what life becomes when it forgets to care, when it forgets to remember, when it feeds on pain and builds on power. She said, "We cannot win by force alone. We must win by choice. We must choose to be more than what we were. We must choose to remember the light." Some in the council agreed with nods and silence. Some argued, saying they must strike now, burn every shadow before it grows again. Others demanded weapons, fleets, walls, shields, more steel, more fire, more fear. But Rourke stepped forward and raised a hand and said, "Fear is the path the hunger wants us to take. Fear is how it finds its way back. We do not fight fear with bigger guns. We fight it with unity, with memory, with truth." The council fell into debate long and loud, but something had already shifted, something that could not be undone. Not by words, not by weapons, something old and new, something strong. In the days that followed, Lyra traveled between worlds not as a commander, but as a messenger. She stood in ruined cities and quiet forests. She stood before crowds and elders and children. She told them what had been lost and what had been found. She told them that peace was not the end of war, but the beginning of something greater. She returned one day to her own world, with skies had once burned red, and the towers had fallen where the bunkers had held screams. Now there was light in the streets and laughter on the wind. Children played where soldiers once bled, and in the center of the old city a statue now stood, not of a hero, not of herself, but of 5 figures standing side by side, their hands joined, their faces lifted toward the sky. She touched the stone gently and closed her eyes, and for the first time since the fall, she let herself smile. But the choice still waited. One night, she walked alone beneath the stars. The fire in her chest stirred gently, as if sensing what she was thinking. She had been offered a place on the new command and alliance, built not for war, but for protection, for rebuilding, for guiding the future. A council of voices, not of orders. Yet part of her still burned, part of her still listened to the stars, to the silence between them, where the hunger still slept. Part of her still wanted to search for the deeper roots, for the darker truths. She met Rourke near the cliff where the city lights faded into the forest. He looked at her and knew without asking. He said, "They want you to lead. They believe in you." She said, "I believe in them too, but the fire inside me is not quiet, not yet." He said, "Then you go, and when you find the next shadow, you will not be alone." She nodded, and together they stood in silence, watching the stars, waiting not for war, but for wonder, for answers, for the next path. The next morning she left, not with fanfare, not with armies, just a small ship, a trusted crew, and the spark that had once saved her world, now guiding her through the dark. They traveled beyond the edge of known space, past maps and signals, past warnings and myths. They found ruins older than memory, stars that sang in voices not heard. For ages, they found peace in strange places and danger in quiet ones, and always they moved forward. They did not search for battle. They searched for understanding, for the roots of the hunger, for the cause behind the shadow. And with each world, with each choice, they lit a new flame, not of war, but of hope. One day, long after the beast had fallen, long after the scars had faded, a child on a far world looked up at a passing ship and asked her mother, "Who are they?" And the mother smiled and said, "They are the ones who chose not to run, not to rule, but to remember." and across the stars in a ship lit by memory Lyra smiled as the fire stirred, once more ready to guide her wherever light was needed.